Dragon breath weapons maybe don't make a lot of sense when you think about them from an evolutionary point of view. It's Dragon Week. It's day 5. We're talking about dragons. So far, we've talked about all the cinematic dragons we love, or in the case of Falcor, the dragon from the Neverending Story, we just sort of look at with a raised eyebrow and go, "What were you thinking?" So I thought we'd talk about gaming dragons today, but specifically, let's talk about breath weapons. And after 50 years of contemplating the breath weapons of the dragons, do they actually make sense from an evolutionary point of view? Of course, I'm trying to find evolutionary logic to D&D. But let's start with the most iconic, the red dragon. I breathe fire. That's classic. That's iconic. That is the top, most iconic, coolest looking breath weapon, right? And it makes the most sense. I want to cook my food. I have evolved to have the ability to cook my food. I assume that the dragon has the ability to also control the level of damage, because 16d6 of breath weapon against a 1d6 deer is not going to leave anything the dragon can eat. But it makes sense. I mean, how does the dragon generate fire? Methane from the food it's eaten, right? There's so many different explanations for how dragons generate the fire and then breathe it out. So yeah, that one makes sense, right? Mostly. I mean, unless you want to argue that, well, I'd argue that it has the ability to control, whether it wants to spit out a 1d6 fireball to cook and eat a deer, or a 16d6 fireball to cook and eat and take out a bunch of player characters that are trying to kill it. But next up, we have the white dragon. The white dragon lives in the snow, and its breath weapon is cold. Everything that would be a predator or prey to the white dragon also lives in the cold, and therefore has adapted to the cold. Therefore, they probably don't take a lot of, if any, damage from the cold. So if you live in the ice, why would your breath weapon be ice? Your breath weapon would probably be something that's the opposite of ice, that makes living in ice easier, and hunting animals that live in the ice and therefore have probably developed an immunity to ice that much easier. So I would think the white dragon should also have a fire breath weapon to keep itself warm. And because creatures that have adapted to the snow probably are more vulnerable to fire. Oh no, he's breathing fire on me. I didn't expect that. I'm a seal that lives 99% of my life in sub-zero water. So cold doesn't bother me. But a 1d6 fireball, that's, oh God. So yeah, white dragon breath weapon doesn't make sense. Black dragon, I breathe out acid, but I'm immune to acid. I assume black dragons are immune to acid, otherwise that wouldn't make any sense. But yeah, I destroy anything that's in the path of my breath weapon. Therefore, I have nothing to eat, because I just spit out hydrochloric acid, which eats through anything. So yeah, I mean, what was it? I don't know. I mean, spitting out acid makes sense. It probably is the one that makes the most sense, since we, as living beings, develop acid in our internal organs to turn the solid masses of food we've consumed into something that we can digest and poop out. So having the ability to sort of spit out a chunk of that acidic saliva to take out your opponents, that makes sense. You could justify that it just only dissolves flesh, and they live mostly on the bones of their prey and the marrow of the bones, or maybe they get some kind of sustenance from the materials that have been dissolved by the acid, what's ever left behind, the sort of chemical goop. But I would say maybe, red dragons and black dragons probably make the most sense. Lightning bolt. I fly in the air and I breathe out lightning bolts. How does this dragon generate static electricity and then able to generate a static electricity blast? Well, first I would say it probably isn't a breath weapon. There's nothing really in our internal system that generates lightning. We are electrical beasts. Our heart is an electrical engine. We do have electrical impulses going through our bodies, but being able to generate static electricity and enough static electricity to spew it out, That's kind of difficult to justify as a breath weapon. But I could justify it as it's, because it flies. Blue dragon's mostly air-based, lighter than air, a lot of electromagnetic current moving through that aerial environment that is the blue dragon's home. It could have adapted ability to sort of just build up that static electricity around it as it's flying. The, lightning and the ability to create lightning is constantly in the air, and it's flying through the air, and it's building up static electricity as it flies, and it has somehow developed the ability to sort of release that built up electricity into lightning bolts, and then of course it has to recharge it. But yeah, I could justify that one. It's a little harder to justify the blue dragon breath weapon, but when you don't think of it as a breath weapon, but more of like sort of an electromagnetic burst that it's capable of generating, similar to like an electric eel, then it makes sense. So I would say they're sort of like flying electric eels. So that one makes sense. But then we've got chlorine gas. I breathe out a breath weapon that kills me. It kills everything. I live in a forest. I breathe out a breath weapon that kills forests. How do you tell where the green dragon is? Just look for all the dead plants. On the bright side, the chlorine gas is the one that would leave the dragons something to eat. Died from poison. I'm assuming the green dragon is immune to poison. So it could just go, poison, wait, watch them die. Very little work on its part. Walk in, eat the perfectly preserved bodies. So from a evolutionary hunting point of view, in the fact that it would produce the most amount of food or the least amount of effort for the green dragon, again, totally makes sense. And we could justify that, well, our bodies do produce some pretty toxic poisons when we burp and fart. So it could just be a buildup of the body's natural gases, and the green dragon has developed the ability to burp out this sort of cloud of toxic eternal gas that is deadly to humanoids and plants. Now, as to why it lives in a forest where its breath weapon causes defoliation and would kill all the plants, chlorine killing plants, not sure. Not sure why that would evolve. It seems like that would be the least likely breath weapon to evolve for something that depends upon the camouflage of plants. You'd probably want to develop a breath weapon or an ability that doesn't harm the plants, doesn't take away your camouflage, but instead takes advantage of where you live. So I could see, poison maybe makes sense, but not really, because, poison would affect the plants, and that would sort of kill your environment. And that doesn't really make sense from an evolutionary point of view. But then again, dragons, evolution. Let's just throw them in this, magic. Doesn't have to make sense. But I could see a green dragon having a different breath weapon that would fit the environment, like a steam breath weapon, a very hot steam. The hot steam would kill its prey, but it wouldn't really affect the plants. It wouldn't affect the dragon's natural camouflage. Maybe some type of subsonic, blast. Doesn't affect the plants, but kills the animals, kills its prey, doesn't affect its camouflage. Yeah, but chlorine gas, while it makes sense biologically, it doesn't make sense from the ecologically from the terrain that the dragon would in. Very rarely do animals develop abilities that actually are counterintuitive to their environment. Creatures that live in the forest tend to develop natural camouflage abilities and tend to evolve abilities that allows them to take advantage of the terrain, like sloths and their little climbing claws. They evolved to be able to take advantage of the terrain. So those are the maze ones. Then we got like some of the weirder ones, like, but it's weird because some of the weirder ones make more sense. Like the dragons whose breath weapon is just a blast of hot wind, or the dragons whose breath weapon is a sonic vibratory blast. Right? That makes sense. Poison breath weapon kind of makes sense. There are venomous animals, and there are venomous animals that do spit poison. And you assume they've developed an immunity to their own venom. A king cobra probably is not going to take damage if you inject a king cobra with its own venom. It's just going to be like, dude, sup? Can't kill me with my own poison. You can kill me with a different poison, but you can't kill me with my poison. So poison spray, poison spit, I'm fine with. A sonic blast makes the most sense. A scalding hot breath or a scalding hot steam, that makes a lot of sense. Basically, if you look at each of the dragon's breath weapons, they range from totally makes sense to kind of makes sense to white dragons. White dragons do not make sense. I get it that you wanted a dragon that lived in the snow. And a snow-based creature usually is white because that way it blends in with its environment, which is environmentally, an adaptation. Polar bears are white, so you don't see them when they're lomping across the white snow. And that's natural camouflage that allows them to avoid predators. Not that polar bears have any predators except for us, but it allows them to sneak up on their prey. Totally makes sense. So the fact that the dragon is the color of its environment makes sense. But as the alpha predator of its environment, its breath weapon is something 90% of its prey would be resistant to. I mean, there are animals that survive and thrive in the sub-zero waters of the Arctic, of the South America and North America, that spend 90% of their lives under the ice cap where it's negative, ridiculous, and they're not bothered by it. They've adapted to the cold. So that would be like me throwing ice cubes, or pouring cold water on the head of some Arctic animal, and the Arctic animal is just like, sup? What is it? What's going on? Why are you pouring water on my head? And you're like, oh, it's supposed to hurt you. It's like, no, I've developed a natural ability to adapt to sub-zero temperatures. You pouring ice cold water on me is just making me wet, which doesn't bother me because I've adapted to that. So white dragons is really the only one that doesn't make sense. Having evolved a cascading breath of hot steam, that would make sense. Having evolved the ability to send out sonic pulses that would only stun your prey, but would make the terrain they're walking across harder to walk across, because you've devastated that ice and now they're struggling. So while they're struggling and while they're stunned, the white dragon could just walk up and go, swap, hello, lunch. That would make sense. Flame breath would totally make sense. Just I guess, basically, no. And then like the dragon that lives in the desert, you would think your dragon that lives in the desert breath weapon would be hot sand, just scooping up sand in its mouth and breathing it out. And sand is devastating even if you live in the desert. Many animals that live in the desert have evolved to resist the heat. Getting hit with a sandstorm that's going 200 miles an hour will just wreck your life. It can literally strip the flesh off bones. So yeah, but that's not what the desert dwelling dragon's breath weapon is. It should be. And the ocean dwelling's breath weapon dragon should maybe makes the most sense that it's just a stream of high pressure water, because even though creatures in the ocean have adapted to the water, it's not really the water, it's the pressure of the water. You're hitting them with that, fire hose level of pressure, that pressure washer level of pressure. And if you can, focus the energy of a water blast enough, it's as powerful as a laser, without being as devastating. So, a high pressure consistent stream of water can eat through rock. So that would make sense. So again, it just feels like the only dragon that doesn't make sense is white dragons. So basically I just spent 14 minutes trying to explain every dragon's ecological niche with their breath weapon and coming to the conclusion that with the exception of white dragons, I could, evolutionary figure out how the dragon would reach there. Green dragons kind of don't make sense. Red dragons, if they can control how hot it is, yeah, sure. My food's cooked. And everybody's afraid of fire, so win-win. Lightning breath weapon, not really make a mistake, but the ability to generate bioelectric energy, that exists in nature. Look at electric eels. So just a dragon has found a way to extend that electric aura farther to stun and incapacitate prey. But yeah, you know, a hot scalding steam would make a lot of sense for a breath weapon. A gust of air would make a lot of sense. A sonic would make a lot of sense for a breath weapon. Spitting out your natural digestive juices, you know. Yeah, so I guess basically, yeah, we're just basically saying white dragons, you make no sense. I don't know. It's Dragon Week. We got to talk about dragons. So there we go. There's probably better videos about dragons than mine, but you know, from an evolutionary anthropological point of view, trying to explain and justify dragon and breath weapon, kind of a fun experiment. See you later.